Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, March 23rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Seymour Hersh says that the CIA planted the Nord Stream cover up story. So, this is very interesting. Seymour Hersh published an article on Substack on Wednesday that said the CIA was instructed to come up with a cover story for the Nord Stream bombings that was fed to the New York Times and the German newspaper Die Zeit. So the cover up story was created to shift blame from the US after Hersh's bombshell report, which was published on February 8th. And that said that President Biden ordered the attack on the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines, which connect Russia to Germany. So he had a quote in this story from what he described as a source within the American intelligence community. This source told him, quote, "It was a total fabrication by American intelligence that was passed along to the Germans and aimed at discrediting your story," end quote. Hersh said that the CIA was ordered to come up with a cover story after President Biden met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Washington on March 3rd. So Scholz's visit was very brief and did not include the routine joint press briefing that usually follows a meeting between the president and another world leader. Scholz's whole visit was just very quick. There was not much press about it. They didn't really tell us what they talked about. But Hersh was told by his sources that his report detailing how the U.S. took out Nord Stream was actually discussed by Biden and Scholz. So Hersh wrote, I'm just going to quote a paragraph from his report here. He said, quote, "I was told by someone with access to diplomatic intelligence that there was a discussion of the pipeline expose, and as a result, certain elements in the Central Intelligence Agency were asked to prepare a cover story in collaboration with German intelligence that would provide the American and German press with an alternative version for the destruction of Nord Stream 2, end quote. So the result of the CIA's work was then published in the New York Times and Die Zeit on March 7th. The New York Times report was very vague and said U.S. officials are now claiming that the Nord Stream bombings might have been carried out by a pro Ukrainian group. I went over it at the time, and the whole story was very strange. And again, it was just very vague. They didn't have any information, but they said, oh, it was probably this pro Ukrainian group that they couldn't say anything about. And then over in Germany, the Die Zeit report claimed that German investigators believe it was carried out by 6 people using a yacht rented in Poland that was owned by 2 Ukrainians. Other Western media outlets published similar articles reinforcing the cover story in the following days. And the overall narrative was that it was Ukrainians that did it, but they weren't tied to the government. They were rogue Ukrainians that did it on this small yacht. That's the story they're going with. But Hersh said that this information that the New York Times received, quote, originated with a group of CIA experts in deception and propaganda whose mission was to feed the newspaper a cover story and to protect a president who made an unwise decision and is now lying about it, end quote. So the cover story offers a radically different narrative than what Hersh's February 8th report alleges. Using anonymous sourcing, Hersh reported that the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed by explosives planted by U.S. Navy divers in June 2022 under the cover of NATO drills in the Baltic Sea. The operation was done in coordination with Norway, and a Norwegian spy plane detonated the explosives by dropping a sonar buoy on September 26, 2022. So the last time Scholz visited Washington was on February 7th, 2022, so before the Russian invasion. And during the press conference that they held after their meeting, President Biden vowed that he would bring an end to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if Russia invades Ukraine. According to Hersh, the plot to destroy the pipelines was already underway at this time, and the plotters took Biden's comment as a blatant threat. So conclude this, I put a paragraph from Hersh's latest report about this cover-up story about what he thinks about Schultz's possible complicity in this operation. He said, quote, "At this point, it must be noted that Chancellor Schultz, whether or not he was alerted of the destruction of the pipeline in advance, still an open question, has clearly been complicit since last fall in support of the Biden administration's cover-up of its operation in the Baltic Sea," end quote. So saying that he's complicit in the cover-up, that is known to Hersh now. So go check out the article. It's on his Substack. I linked to it here. And he discusses some other things about European, the cost to energy and stuff following the pipeline sabotage. But just the whole thing, this is what I suspected, that the way that those stories were put out there. It was the New York Times, Die Zeit, and then all these other outlets in the following days. It seemed like a coordinated dump of these stories to kind of fog up the narrative, just to confuse people, muddle the waters about this whole situation when it comes to Nord Stream. All right, the next one here. The U.S. offers Slovakia helicopters for sending MiG-29s to Ukraine. So the U.S. is offering to give Slovakia attack helicopters and Hellfire missiles as a reward for sending Ukraine Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets. So Slovak Defense Minister Jaroslav Nad said that the deal would be for 12 Bell AH-1Z attack choppers and 500 Hellfire missiles that these choppers can use, and training that would be involved with that. So this sale is worth about $1 billion, and the U.S. is offering to provide $660 million in financing for the deal, and Slovakia would pay the remaining $340 million. Although separately, the EU is going to give Slovakia $213 million. So when it's all said and done, Slovakia would only have to pay, a little over $100 million for this big deal. And Nod said that the offer was still being considered, but added that acquiring the helicopters, would be good for Slovakia. So it sounds like they might take this offer that the U.S. has given them. So Slovakia, without its MiG-29, Slovakia doesn't have an air force, and Poland and the Czech Republic, who are both neighbors of the landlocked country, are now monitoring their airspace. Slovakia signed a deal back in 2018 to purchase 14 U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets to replace their MiGs, but they're not going to be delivered until 2024. So the thing about this U.S. offer is that it means that the U.S. was involved in Slovakia's decision to send 13 MiG-29s to Ukraine, which came after Poland announced that it would provide Kiev with the same Soviet-made jets. And this makes Poland and Slovakia the first NATO members to arm Ukraine with fighter jets. So go back a year, and Poland was trying to give Ukraine its MiGs right at the start of the war, and the U.S. said no. They were concerned about escalation. NATO officials said at the time that Russia could view the move as NATO directly entering the war. But, a year later, this concern over escalation is gone. So it does look like the U.S. was involved in this. And still, no sign yet that the U.S. is going to give Ukraine F-16s. I think they will eventually, but I would be surprised if it happens soon. I think that's more of a longer term plan. All right, the next one here. This is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. The U.S. to temporarily fly drones further from Crimea. So the U.S. is planning to keep its aircraft further away from the Russian territory in the Black Sea. This is according to a CNN report. And the decision came after a Russian fighter jet intercepted and collided with a Reaper drone, causing the American aircraft to go down in the Black Sea. So the CNN cited unnamed sources who said that the U.S. will keep its drones away from Russian territory temporarily to avoid being too provocative. So they're acknowledging that flying these drones in that area is provocative to Russia, especially when there's a war going on. And the official added that drone flights would continue this way for the time being, but said there's already an appetite to return to routes closer to Russia. So it's just interesting because, the Pentagon says, oh, it's just a routine flight, no big deal. Russia shouldn't be upset about it. But here you have these officials acknowledging that flying in that area is provocative. And again, also publicly, the Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, have said that they're going to continue these flights, but it does look like they're backing off a little bit, which that's good, I would say. Okay, the next one here: China slams U.S. criticism of Ukraine peace efforts. So, China on Wednesday hit back at U.S. criticism of Beijing's efforts to push for peace talks to end the fighting in Ukraine as Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his 3-day visit to Moscow. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters on Tuesday that China was not impartial on the war in Ukraine due to its relationship with Russia, comments that drew a rebuke from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, quote, "The U.S. says China's position cannot be seen as impartial. Does that mean pouring weapons into the conflict should be seen as impartial? Does that mean causing the crisis to escalate should be seen as impartial?" End quote. And I think that's a good point. The U.S. definitely can't say that they're impartial when they've spent over $100 billion on this war and are supporting Ukraine in every manner short of, direct, sending troops to fight Russian troops on the ground. Wang described Xi's trip to Moscow as, quote, "a journey of friendship, cooperation, and peace," end quote. He also called on the U.S. to stop stoking the conflict in Ukraine. Wang said, quote, "We call on the U.S. to reflect on its own role in the Ukraine issue, stop fueling the flames, and stop deflecting the blame on China. We will continue to stand firm on the side of peace and dialogue," end quote. And of course, the U.S. came out very strongly against China's efforts to foster negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Before Xi's trip, our pal Kirby said that the U.S. was against a ceasefire, said a ceasefire was unacceptable. And then Antony Blinken said that the world should not be fooled by China's initiative. So, despite this, Xi is still expected to soon speak with Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and that would mark their first conversation since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Zelensky has expressed an openness to the 12-point peace plan, and he wants to speak with Xi, although other top Ukrainian officials have ruled out the idea of negotiating with Putin. I'll get more into that in the next one. So besides discussing Ukraine, and also I don't think Zelensky, I don't know if he would really entertain China's proposals or if he just is trying to keep a good relationship with China. But besides, this trip was big in the sense, in the other aspects, the things that Xi and Putin agreed on. They also vowed to strengthen trade and other aspects of their partnership, including increasing transactions using the yuan, efforts these two nations see as vital to creating a more multipolar world. There's an interesting quote from Xi when he was leaving the Kremlin. This is on video. He told Putin, quote, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together," end quote. And then Putin nodded and said he agreed with that. So it just gives you an idea of what, how they're viewing what they're doing it as this monumental shift in the geopolitical landscape. And it is U.S. policies that did this, that drove Russia and China so close together as they are now. It wasn't like this before, but now again they're both facing similar pressure from the West. Okay, the next one here. So Ukraine says that the ICC arrest warrant means no negotiations with Putin. So Ukrainian officials have said that the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant that was issued last week for Russian President Vladimir Putin has made negotiations with the Russian leader impossible. So Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to Zelensky, wrote on Twitter after the warrant was issued that now that labeling Putin, quote, "an obvious international criminal," directly means there will be no negotiations with the current Russian elite, end quote. Other Ukrainian officials told Politico that peace talks are hard to imagine now that the warrant was issued over allegations that Russia is forcibly deporting Ukrainian children. So Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, he pointed to the fact that the Ukrainian government had previously ruled out negotiating with Putin at all. Although Zelensky later softened on this position slightly, I think the U.S. wanted him to do that just publicly to not rule out talking with Putin. although he kept up his demands that, all Russian troops must leave before talks can begin. But anyway, so Kuleba said, quote, "We knew long before the ICC arrest warrant that talking to Putin made no sense. Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council adopted a legal resolution on September 30th of last year declaring that any negotiations with Vladimir Putin were impossible in response to Russia's attempted annexation of additional Ukrainian territories," end quote. So the ICC warrant was issued just a few days before Xi went to Moscow, and it was after China released the peace plan. After talks on, Putin said that he did welcome the Chinese proposals, but now, Ukrainian officials are saying no negotiations with Putin because of this warrant. And the Biden administration supports the arrest warrant for Putin, even though, like the US, Russia is not a party to the ICC. The Biden administration has previously rejected ICC efforts to investigate non-member states. In 2021, when the ICC opened an investigation into Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, Secretary of State Antony Blinken strongly condemned the move. He said, quote, "The United States firmly opposes and is deeply disappointed by this decision. The ICC has no jurisdiction over this matter. Israel is not a party to the ICC and has not consented to the court's jurisdiction. And we have serious concerns about the ICC's attempts to exercise its jurisdiction over Israeli personnel," end quote. So, they are using, now that the court is going after somebody they want them to go after, they're all gung-ho. But as soon as they ever turn their eyes on the U.S. or Israel or any other close allies, the U.S., is not happy about it. All right. The next one here, speaking of Israeli war crimes, Israeli airstrikes target Syria's Aleppo airport for the second time this month. So this was early Wednesday that these Israeli airstrikes hit the Aleppo airport, and this comes as that region of Syria is still recovering from a devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey on February 6th. So a Syrian military source told the Syrian news agency Sana, quote, "At about 3:55 a.m. on Wednesday, the Israeli enemy launched an aerial act of aggression with a number of missiles from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea, west of Latakia, targeting the vicinity of Aleppo International Airport," end quote. So the source did not report any casualties, but said material damage had been done. So the head of Syria's civil aviation said that the strike did put the airport out of service again, but added that the airport should be resuming work within a short period. So the city of Aleppo was seriously damaged by the earthquake. A lot of people died there. A lot of buildings, crumbled. And this is a city that was destroyed in the war. So it's like just a double whammy for the people living there. They've been struggling to rebuild from the war because U.S. sanctions on Syria specifically target reconstruction. They want to prevent the country from rebuilding. And then they're hit with this earthquake. And the Aleppo airport has been receiving a ton of flights, of aid flights, earthquake aid. And this is the second time that the Israelis put this airport out of service. Earlier this month, they had to reroute air flights to Damascus. So, they just keep it up. And, you don't hear a peep out of the U.S., over this. So the UN, I know a UN official at least condemned the last Israeli airstrike because they said it halted all UN aid deliveries into the city. So maybe we'll see another statement from them after this one. Hopefully they get it up and running soon. All right, the next one here, the Arizona State Senate passes the Defend the Guard Act. So this is an interesting piece of legislation. I should cover these efforts more often, but so on Tuesday, the Arizona State Senate passed the Defend the Guard Act, which is legislation that would prohibit the deployment of Arizona's National Guard to combat zones without a declaration of war from Congress, as required by the Constitution. So the bill passed in a vote of 16-13 along partisan lines. All the Republicans voted for it. All the Democrats voted against it. The lead sponsor of the bill was Arizona Senator Wendy Rogers. She is a retired lieutenant colonel who served in the U.S. Air Force for 20 years. She said in a closing speech on the bill, quote, if the president wants to use the Arizona National Guard to fight wars halfway across the world, then it can only be done after a majority of the people's representatives vote to send them there. If Congress refuses to vote, then it's a war that Arizona National Guard should not be fighting, end quote. And of course, the National Guard has been deployed all over, and they get deployed to Syria still. And that war has no authorization, of course. So the Defend the Guard Act now heads to the Arizona House of Representatives. It already has 10 co-sponsors over there, and that chamber has 60 members. Arizona residents are encouraged to contact their representatives to tell them to support this bill. And I have a link in here where if you live in Arizona, you could find your legislator. And the Arizona State Senate is the first state legislature to pass the Defend the Guard Act. This is an effort years in the making. So Dan McKnight, who is the chairman of Bring Our Troops Home, this is a group that was founded in 2019 to advocate for ending unconstitutional wars. He said, quote, yesterday was historic, exactly 20 years and 1 day after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The Arizona State Senate has passed legislation that will ensure their National Guard will never again participate in unconstitutional wars that Congress refuses to take accountability for. My team and I have laid the groundwork for 4 years to reach this point. We could not be more proud of all the Arizonans who called their legislators in support of the Defend the Guard Act. Through education, we can move mountains and together end our endless wars, end quote. So according to his organization, a version of the Defend the Guard Act has been introduced in 18 states so far this year, and more are expected. On Tuesday, the bill was introduced in Maine by Senator Eric Brakey. He's a Republican. And when he introduced the bill, Brakey said, quote, over these last 20 years, the men and women of the 50 state National Guards have accounted for nearly half of the active duty troops in Washington, D.C.'s undeclared forever wars in the Middle East. The Constitution requires Congress to declare war before sending our guardsmen into foreign battlefields, end quote. So that's a pretty big statistic. Nearly half of the active duty troops that have been deployed to the Middle East. It's huge. So you can visit defendtheguard.us to see if Defend the Guard Act legislation has been introduced to your state. They have this helpful map. And there's also other information. I think they're looking to start a phone bank. I think the next state they're focusing on is Texas. It's been introduced. Oh, that's Oklahoma. It's been introduced in a committee. I forget the name of the committee, but it has to get past this committee first. And then once it gets past there, then the state Senate votes on it, then the state House of Representatives. So this is a pretty big movement, 18 states and counting. So, and it's a good way to kind of take back the war powers from the president. So definitely go check that out. You could also go to bringourtroopshome.us and find more info there. All right, the next one here, U.S. and South Korea to hold their largest ever live fire drills. So we've been hearing that quite a lot lately, you know, the largest ever military drills. Israel and the U.S. recently did their largest ever. The Philippines are planning their largest ever. And now South Korea's defense ministry said Wednesday that the U.S. and South Korea will hold their largest ever live fire drills this June. A move that will anger Pyongyang and will ensure that tensions on the Korean Peninsula will remain high. The ministry said that the drills would be conducted to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. According to South Korea's Yonhap news agency, Washington and Seoul have conducted massive combined live fire drills less than 10 times. So these are pretty rare, it seems like. And the last time they did it was in 2017. So that was around the time that the Trump administration stopped conducting major exercises with South Korea as part of an effort to reduce tensions and make room for diplomacy. But the Biden administration has resumed major drills with South Korea, and the U.S. and Seoul are currently conducting their largest war games in 5 years. That's happening right now, known as Freedom Shield. And North Korea, of course, has responded by conducting more weapons tests. On Wednesday, Pyongyang fired cruise missiles into the sea about a week after testing one of their ICBMs. So this is just where we're at now. Tit for tat escalations, and the Freedom Shield exercises are wrapping up on Thursday, but they're already planning more joint military drills, I think even before these massive live fire drills. And the Biden administration has shown no interest in reducing tensions, and there's no sign that this is going to stop. So who knows what this could lead to? And I think a big part of this is that Yoon, the new South Korean president, he's more hawkish on North Korea. And the US is just kind of giving him everything that he wants, I think, because they want South Korea to be an ally against China. I think that's what a lot of this is about. Um, all right. So the last news story here, this is from Consortium News. It's interesting. Iraq invasion, AUKUS blasted in rousing Sydney rally. So this was a rally in Sydney, Australia, a week after Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese agreed in a meeting in San Diego with President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, British Prime Minister, to spend 368 billion Australian dollars to buy nuclear submarines from the two countries. Anti-war activists met in a sweltering Sydney town hall on Sunday on the 20th anniversary of the start of the war against Iraq to hear why the submarine deal is a disaster for Australia that must be stopped. So Greens Party Senator David Shoebridge, former Foreign Minister Bob Carr, retired diplomat Alison Bronowski, and Colin Powell's former chief of staff, Lawrence Wilkinson, he was there via video link. They told the rally that an aggressive United States was dragging Australia into an unnecessary conflict with its main trading partner, China, a country which posed no threat. Albanese agreed to the deal with no oversight from Parliament and without the consent of the Australian people, the rally was told. And then there's videos here and summaries of it. So go check all that out. And I think they're right. And I do care a lot about Australia because I have in-laws there. That's where my wife's from. And I think they're really getting a raw deal out of this whole AUKUS situation. All right. That is it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Anya Parampil over at the Gray Zone. She says, I am the Kremlin intermediary who tried to help Tucker Carlson interview Putin. Apparently, she used some of her contacts to try to make that happen. And then the NSA, I think, was surveilling Tucker. And she's someone that they called a Kremlin intermediary, or U.S. officials did. So go check that out. It's an interesting story. One from John Reynolds. Why the hell is the U.S. occupying Syria? I think that is a very good question. One from TJ Coles. The military intelligentsia complex. How higher education enables U.S. militarism. The invasion of Iraq wasn't a mistake. It was a crime, by Ben Burgess over at Jacobin. And our spotlight is from James Bovard over at the American Conservative. Iraq war may be over, but the war party carries on. All right, that's everything for today. Always support us at antiwar.com/donate and share the show around. I feel like it's really growing. I'm getting a lot more. Most people listen to the audio version. The downloads have been just keep going up. So it's great. It's pretty cool. I'm really happy with how this is all going. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.